Once upon a lightly snow-dusted glade in the realm of yesteryear, a rather peculiar event was unfolding, the earliest forms of women's Olympic skating. Imagine, if you will, athletes wrapped in layers upon layers of woolen attire, because before fleece and lycra, there was wool. The handle with care fabric that proved to be both a source of warmth and a method of endurance training. Try doing a sit spin wearing an entire sheep. These pioneering women weren't just skaters. They were intrepid adventurers of the icy kingdom. Sporting skirts that flirted perilously with their ankles, they glided, or attempted to glide, on blades that looked more like they belonged to a cutlery drawer. The wondrous world of figure skating, it turns out, had all the glamour of a very trepidatious interest group, making the best of winter weather and leftover kitchen utensils. As candles flickered like ancient floodlights around the quaint rinks, laughter and muffled gasps drifted over the ice. The audience, bundled in furs and scarves resembling the plumage of an exotic bird exhibit, huddled together for warmth. It was a cozy yet comical scene. This was before the era when skating venues felt the compulsion to mimic the tundra. You see, the Olympic Games only introduced women's skating in the early 1900s, but even before then, women were taking to frozen ponds with all the enthusiasm of penguins on caffeine. Despite less than ideal equipment, and believe me, less than ideal is putting it mildly, these daring ladies attempted jumps and spins. Their moves, perhaps less triple axel and more single wibble, carried the sheer thrill of not immediately falling. The most notorious of these ice heroines was one Agnes Hooley, a name you've likely never heard unless you're deeply invested in obscure sports trivia or perhaps a distant Hooley relative. Agnes charmed with her signature move, an attempt at a jump that mostly resulted in her hovering above the ice like a mildly agitated hummingbird before gracefully crumbling back to the ground. It wasn't elegant, but it was certainly riveting. One must imagine that early women's Olympic skating required not only athletic skill, but also an impressive tolerance for embarrassment and the frozen elements. Audience gasps were often reserved not for spectacular moves, but for miraculous recoveries from near tumbles. In these icy exploits lies a quaint humor. Their perseverance in sheep-heavy attire and glorified butter knives showed an inspirational zest for life and left behind a legacy richer than any gold medal. So as the night draws closer and you snuggle further into your blanket, let these stories of skating pioneers wash over you like the softest snowfall. Their dedication to sporting excellence serves as a calming reminder that sometimes triumph looks a lot like trying, and possibly failing with grace. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. And now, as the fire crackles low and the wind whispers tales of gold and glinting ice, perhaps you'll join us in the next chapter, when the story unfolds just a little more. Nestled between the softly crinkling pages of history, the winter of 1908 brought with it the frost-ravened spectacle of the Olympic ice skating competition, an event that could only be described as a polished waltz of chaos and elegance. As the world stepped tentatively onto the icy stage of women's figure skating, a debut event, the audience was treated to a spirited display that straddled the line somewhere between art and injury. In those early days, ice skates were little more than blades hastily riveted to boots that seemed better suited for shepherding sheep than shredding figure eights. The skaters, each a pioneer with courage woven into their woolen tights, lacked the luxury of today's high-tech gear. Instead, they relied on the same tenacious spirit shared by the famed explorers of the age. One imagines that if Ernest Shackleton were to judge the competition, he would have likely praised their survival skills more than their salchos. It was against this backdrop that a remarkable figure emerged. Madge Sayers, a woman whose very presence sent polite ripples across the stagnant pond of the patriarchal sporting world. Imagine, if you will, curling up in the audience with a warm cup of acknowledgements for a pioneer who, not a few years earlier, had won her husband's silver medal in the British Figure Skating Championships. Yes, she competed in the men's category and bagged the silver, because, quite simply, no rule ever said she couldn't or shouldn't. The 1908 Olympics marked the first time people were allowed to see women like Madge on a platform where they could twirl and glide with the unyielding grace of 1,000 swan necks. But unlike the swans, who, incidentally, never had to contend with the hidden menace of thin ice, our early skaters faced the perilous whimsy of outdoor rinks. Ah yes, the outdoor rink, where the elegance of a performance was rivaled only by the anticipation of plummeting through a poorly healed crack in the ice. It was a gamble, not for the faint of heart, much like speed dating or attempting to buy a house in today's market. The attire was another triumph of fashion over practicality, surely designed by a committee that had specific instructions to ensure each competitor resembled a float in an Edwardian parade, rather than an athlete at the height of their prowess. This sartorial grandeur often led to colourful moments when too zealous a spin would unravel a stray button, leading to improvised choreography and unplanned audience participation as props went flying. Skating routines themselves were something of a whimsical flight of fancy. There were no structured program elements like triple Lutz or quad toe loop flip, double cheeseburger that modern skaters must tackle. Instead, movements were named after the creatives who invented them. Indeed, a golden era for anyone narcissistic enough to leave a legacy in the form of the Armstrong Wiggle or the Beatrice Bamboozler. Yet, through these potential pitfalls, the Olympic performances unfolded like dream sequences narrated by a particularly capricious Morpheus. Spectators, bundled up in coats large enough to be mistaken for mobile cathedrals, watched in rapt wonder, their breath misting in the chilled air of early 20th century Britain. Despite the hazards, the skaters possessed a certain alchemy, transforming a sheet of ice into a canvas and themselves into brushes dipped in grace. By the time the final curtain had lowered on the first women's Olympic ice skating competition, not a soul remained uncertain of the sport's power to captivate and, indeed, entrance. As the chiming of nearby church bells rang out like a symphony of acceptance, Madge Sayers stood triumphant, a golden heroine of the rink, an artist with a slightly damp brush, as lessons were learned, for future female skaters to seek less dangerous grounds, perhaps indoors. So, as you nestle beneath your covers, let the thought of Madge gliding effortlessly across the ice soothe your dreams. There, beneath the starlit sky, she carves a path for history that is yet to unfold, and our delightful journey continues. Once upon a time, long before Olympic figure skaters defied gravity with elegant ease, they faced a reality more akin to a slippery obstacle course than a graceful ballet on ice. The world of early women's Olympic skating was one where the ice rink resembled an icy battlefield, and the audience sat in awe, breath held, waiting for the inevitable, not-so-dainty landing. Picture, if you will, the year is 1924. The location, the enchanting, snow-capped town of Chamonix, France. The very first Winter Olympic Games are underway, a daring idea that must have seemed as risky as skating in a skirt that brushes the ankles. Female athletes, or rather pioneers of frost, glide onto the rink in garments that could double as fashionable evening wear, complete with fur trim and all the grace a thick woolen skirt could muster. Now, imagine the scene unfolding as Helga, our hypothetical protagonist, and her fellow skaters take to the ice. They are armed not with the luxurious support of modern, polyurethane-coated blades, but with skates that are essentially sharpened slabs of steel, inventions that, at their best, might have been borrowed from the local blacksmith. Add to this the fact that ice conditions were less carefully groomed and more slightly flattened tundra, and you have quite the sporting spectacle. Oh, but the drama has only begun to unfold. In these early days, attempted jumps were like daring pleas to the gods of physics. Helga's coach had advised her that conquering a single rotation jump could lead to glory, or at the very least, a brief sensation of airborne freedom followed by a graceful spiraling crash. It was a dance between ambition and humility, a key ingredient for making history, as we all know. As the women skated bravely onward, the judges of the time, perched precariously on wobbly chairs, scribbled on their scorecards in a manner that suggested they were either chronicling athletic feats or sketching their latest architectural drafts for ice palaces. Either way, the commentary whispered amongst the spectators involved amazement sprinkled with an instinctive nod to the absurdity of combing ice with frock-led fashion. Then came the performances themselves. Picture Helga, champions in spirit if still fledgling in form. Her arms spread like wings, her face a mask of concentration as she built momentum. The crowd watched in part wonder, part trepidation. With a slight bend of her knees and a deep breath, she attempted what would be, by today's standards, a simple jump. It was called a hop, though landing it often resembled a slightly more controlled tumble, with a distinct touch of elegance, if you squinted just right. As our adventurous skaters made their attempts, it's worth noting the sheer courage involved, braving not only the ice but gravity, layers of wool, and societal expectations wrapped up in notions of ladylike decorum. These women weren't just skating, they were trailblazing. Sure, subsequent skaters would eventually land triple axels with seemingly effortless grace, but these pioneers set the stage with performances that were as unpredictably delightful as they were valiant. And as Helga glides to her finale, arms aloft in what could best be described as a defiant twirl of victory, there's a sense of accomplishment not just for her, but for all women tapping their feet in synchronized rhythm with progress. The audience bursts into applause, fueled by a tipple of mulled wine perhaps, but also genuine admiration for these extraordinary ice-dancing women. As the cheers echo into the starry night, we leave Helga and her companions sliding across the icy stage of history, emboldened by their daring feats. The skaters have triumphed, not just on the frieze, but also in our hearts, where stories of courage, laughter, and frosty elegance continue to skate circles in our dreams. And with that, we gently close the scene, but not before considering the next dreamy chapter of this icy, heroic saga. In the hushed, sepia-toned world of early Olympic women's skating, a time before the quadruple Lutz or glittery sequin overloads, things were a touch more primitive, and by primitive, I mean downright hazardous. Picture, if you will, the scene. Wooden skating rinks described kindly as rustic, where the ambience was more of a ye-old tavern with a slight inclination towards frostbite. Our story meanders into the curious case of wooden skates. Imagine standing on two thin, just strips of wood, each pretending to be ice-worthy blades, with fans enthusiastically, yet sometimes mistakenly, cheering for survival rather than artistry. The subtle, rhythmic glide on the rink sounded more like staccato clattering, as brave maidens attempted to defy gravity and common sense. It's fascinating, really, how the spectators viewed these early competitions. In the grandstands, or rather, the haphazardly thrown-together bleachers, onlookers donned what can only be described as layers upon layers of woolen fashion statements, each more adventurous and warmer than the last. They were practical, of course, but also seemed ready to dash off to audition for a Christmas carol at any given moment. The combination made spectators look like patient battalions knitted by 1,000 grannies. Back on the ice, the challenges were abundant. The athletes dressed in attire that could best be described as last-minute ski holiday acquisition, with skirts long enough to disguise any missteps, creating a scene of relentless whooshing fabric attempting its own Olympic twirl. Somewhere between an elegant swan and a spinning top, our spirited skaters ventured across the ice, embroiled in a valiant contest against the very concept of physics. Let's turn our attention to the perils presented by the rinks themselves. These early stages of dream-filled sliding were not enclosed marvels of engineering, as we find today, with their zambonis and meticulously regulated climates. Instead, they were enhancers of character building, open to the elements. Rain or snow. No problem. Just another unique, albeit questionable view on how ice skating might gracefully adapt to swamp conditions. While the competitors twirled and leaped, sometimes intentionally and often not, the judges sat huddled fragrantly in close quarters. Their task was to determine which skater could, on that particular day, best balance the indelicate dance between grace and gravity's harsh embrace, all while maintaining composure that suggested their skates had not been constructed during a woodshop experiment gone awry. Judging panels back then were more about getting the most out of a seat cushion than understanding technical revolution. But they got by, flourishing belly laughs amongst secretly sympathetic glances as each skater clung to the hope of impressing with every impossibly upright finish line glide. In this curious dance of ambition versus reality, no Triple Axel or Salchow could hold a candle to the universally lauded and unplanned innovations in falls, which were more frequent than returns to elegant posture. The tumble was an involuntary ritual, met not with cruelty, but with the pure hope that one would bounce rather than splat when meeting the ice's unforgiving embrace. As you begin to succumb to the gentle embrace of sleep, imagine those early heroines, sturdy skated explorers of a brave, new icy world. Each glide, wobble, and oft hilarious fall charted new territories, defying not just their own dainty courage, but paving the way for the complex pirouettes of future generations. Their journey makes for quite the bedtime story, a testament to boldness lacquered with layer upon layer of society's quirkiest winter woolens. And so, dear dreamer, what were these pioneering women but winter's knights, courageously carving out graceful battles, granting peace and resolution at each glide's finale? Drift now peacefully into that quiet world where dreams, like skaters, glide effortlessly. In the peaceful dawn of the 20th century, when the world was busy perfecting colossal airships and debating the necessity of sidewalks, a number of daring women were strapping on their skates, ready to glide into untested waters of Olympic history. If you listen carefully, you might still hear the whispers of their skates cutting through the ice, mingling with laughter and an occasional gasp of wonder from the onlookers. Imagine, if you will, a scene draped in gentle snowfall, where a hush envelops a shimmering expanse of ice. Here, grand parlors of yesteryear held grandiose tales of the sport most elegant, figure skating. A time when one mistakenly uttered phrase, Triple Axel, may have sounded more like instructions to a lumberjack than an athletic triumph. The scene was set for the 1908 Summer Olympics in London, an epoch when Victorian sensibilities clung to their petticoats while inching towards modernity. Yes, you heard right, the Summer Olympics. Figure skating had its debut not on snowy soil, but amid the blooming flowers and errant whispers of June. Such was the delightful inconsistency of a nascent Olympic schedule. Enter Madge Sayers, a trailblazer with the charm of a London spring and steely determination rivaling an industrial chimney. Deciding against societal norms and corsets alike, Madge chose the ice over ballroom floors. Whether it was the allure of freedom or merely the benefit of not having to make compulsory conversation was anyone's guess. Yet she twirled with a grace that turned the icy rink into a stage of sparkling wonderment. As her skates whispered secrets to the ice, a crowd, likely bundled up against the surreal chill of winter in June, watched entranced. Her glissades and arabesques painted stories of feminine grace and defiance, blending into a seamless performance that delighted both monarchs and common folk. But Madge was not one to be deterred by mere applause. In a time when safety gear consisted of whatever padding a layered skirt could provide, she dared to push the boundaries, experimenting with jumps and spins that would give modern orthopedists palpitations. Every leap was a risky tango with physics, a flirtation with a bruised dignity, and potentially frigid landing. Madge's courage knew no bounds, or stable ankles. Taking on the establishment was not for the faint-hearted. The very idea of women skating competitively was so radical it was sparked a revolution but for the sheer charm Madge displayed on the ice. Her poise and precision in laced-up boots, as if minded by an unseen force, heralded not only a personal triumph, but a universal recognition of talent that transcended the restrictive edicts of gender politics. Yet the ice was an unpredictable partner, sometimes complicit, and other times jealous, sending skaters sprawling in fits of capriciousness. No wonder, then, that the early rounds of women's skating were filled with the promise of elegance punctuated by the occasional unscheduled pirouette into a snowbank. Such unexpected dips often added an extra layer of spectacle to the proceedings, testing both the resolve and the tailbone of every ambitious skater. Back then, an evening at an Olympic skating rink was less about the intricacies of a perfect camel spin and more about breath-catching leaps and the warmth of shared ambitions under the canopy of an open sky. The air crackled with the glide of blades and dreams. Volleys of laughter mingled with gasps as gravity and grace joined in their complex quadrille. As the wind wove tales of triumph over every performed figure eight, it was clear that women like Madge were not just competing for medals, but for a place at the table of history. And they danced across the ice as though scribbling their names onto the water, whispering sweet defiance against any who might doubt their place in the world of sport. So, as we leave this frozen theatre of bygone Olympics, the scene warmly fades, the silhouettes of skaters growing softer against the backdrop of twilight snow. A brief pause, perhaps for a cup of cocoa or a gentle sigh, and the tail waits patiently to glide forward, beckoning new horizons beyond the glistening ice. As we glide gently into the dimly lit world of early women's Olympic skating, imagine, if you will, an era where the triple axel was less about acrobatics and more about defying gravity's very nature, just as one might defy a particularly stubborn featherbed. The scene, the early 1900s, a time when women took the ice in attire that would make today's figure skaters wince in sympathy and perhaps uncontrollable laughter. In this wondrous epoch, skating outfits were extravagantly detailed but hardly aerodynamic. Imagine layered skirts that looked as if someone took the entire drapery section from the local haberdashery and decided, this will do, along with woolen stockings that required Herculean effort just to stay upright, much like trying to dance while wrapped in an over-enthusiastic octopus. But for these women, each shimmering spin was both a spectacle and a breakthrough, a mesmerizing dance with historical significance, slipping quietly beneath the blades. Back then, smooth ice was more a suggestive term, hinting at a fantasy many rinks could only aspire to. Early rinks were more like temperamental crumpets, lumpy, unpredictably frozen lumps that frequently turned figure skating into a contact sport. The prospect of executing a graceful pirouette without plummeting into an unexpectedly crispy pothole required monumental courage and an astounding sense of humor. Peering through the frosty veil of time, we meet our intrepid skaters, faces often framed by windswept curls peeking from beneath delicately knitted hats. There was Madge Sayers, the daring inaugural queen of women's figure skating. Picture her as a determined heroine, planning her routine like an elegant conductor, preparing an orchestra of dizzying pirouettes and classical footwork, with the occasional hiccup, perhaps a not-so-stealthy pause, to tiptoe around threatening chunks of ice that had stealthily turned into an audience all their own. As legend has it, Madge ventured into competitions that were curiously devoid of categories for women until she kindly insisted on altering the course of history. And by insist, I mean she elegantly glided into what was then a men's competition and carved her name onto the frosty pages of Olympic history. Her presence on the ice was a serenade to future generations, a promise that women could compete and captivate, one delicately defied convention at a time. Patience, grace, and a touch of rebellion helped pave a trail that sparkled behind her. Her charm was such that even the ice reluctantly yielded under her blades. Yet Madge wasn't the only pioneer. Others followed in her ice-grazing footsteps, donned with courage and the proverbial patience to navigate the glacial grids, akin to an autumnal leaf dance, choreographed by the whims of the wind. Under jagged formations of chandeliers, casting cinematic glows, each competition was a symphony of potential triumphs and graceful stumbles upon history's icy stage. Skaters twirled to rhythms unheard by those off the rink, their spins echoing tales of wit frozen in time. As the moon enveloped these icy arenas in a silvery cocoon, floral whispers of encouragement drifted from hushed crowds who, bundled in curious assortments of winterwear, felt more a part of the act than mere observers. The performances were as much about endurance as they were artistry, each skater defying fate and frostbite, moving as though writing notes in frozen air. Even as our lids grow heavier, dreamed-on drifts revealing cottony clouds, we hold one foot cautiously at the edge of history's ice rink, teetering between sleep and awakeness. Let us gently shelf these tales, for the whims of skating's early days have only begun to entangle dreams with droll, discordant spins. Is there more beneath the mirrors of ancient ice? Indeed, but all in due time. In the meantime, allow your dreams to wander as we float softly, shifting smoothly into the unraveling tapestry of yet another yarn. History shimmering under the frost-kissed beam of remembered moonlight. As the dawn of the 20th century unfolded, a peculiar phenomenon wobbling on blades made its debut at the world stage early: women's Olympic figure skating. An activity that promised grace but regularly delivered tumbles and fancy pirouettes, much to the delight and, at times, dismay of its audiences. Imagine, if you will, a time before sequins were aplenty, and before the jump name sounded like something you'd order off a space-age coffee menu. The athletes, bless their dedicated hearts, bravely took to the ice in garments designed by none other than architects of winter discomfort. At a time when there was still much debate about whether a woman should even break a sweat, these pioneering skaters donned skirts stiff enough to rival a stubborn 2x4. Picture, if you wish, the elegant struggle of performing a loop jump with petticoats that could easily double as an extra tent on a camping trip. Now, there's something delightfully ironic that the first Olympics to feature these icy heroines was the 1908 Summer Games in London. One can almost hear the blades protesting against the sun's warm embrace, probably thinking, "Wrong season, dear humans." Yet the excitement of this icy competition was enough to overlook the seasonal faux pas. Dorothy Greenhouse Smith, one of the early stars, gracefully glided into the history books. Her performance was strategically inventive, a heady mix of ballet moves and what one might kindly describe as improvised landings. Whether her graceful demeanor on the ice was part fear, part bravery, remains a mystery. Yet, it threw into perspective the apparent risk-taking needed at the time to achieve what would today barely make it to a blooper reel on YouTube. The official attire of the day was an engineering marvel, a frosty compromise between societal propriety and the semblance of movement. These adventurous women donned dresses extending below their knees, with sleeves robust enough to suggest that perhaps these were borrowed from an Olympic fencing match. And with hats that seemed primed for Sunday church rather than a spin. At exhilarating speed, an accidental somersault risks sending one's feathered headwear ambitiously airborne. Audiences, bundled in their own pragmatic layers against the chill of early 20th century ice rinks, gulped down hot beverages as the skaters attempted jumps reminiscent of playing hopscotch on an autumn afternoon. But here's the heartwarming secret. Each wobble, stumble, and triumphing recovery was met with warmly enthused applause. Yes, even Albert of Britain was known to hide a smirk beneath his well-twirled mustache after a particularly spectacular fall that ended with the skater laughing on the ice, conniving new ways to trick gravity the next time around. It bears mentioning that off the ice, the skaters were treated more like curiosities than athletes. Praise and patronizing came in equal measure, often accompanied by curious onlookers posing profound questions like, "Why?" to which the standard response hinted at a mysterious joy only found in icy breezes and the sound of blade meeting ice. Slowly, and with the occasional chorus of creaking ice, whispers of change floated about. Rumors of a time not too far off where women might slide stylishly into trousers. Trousers that wouldn't contribute to the likelihood of extending hospital waiting times. Thus, we bid these daring dames a fond night's cheer, for they had started a revolution that no one yet realized was afoot. As you slip into the layers of history woven into your blanket, know that each skater blazed a path we glide on still, setting the icy stage for the sequined marvels that would eventually triple axel their way into the future chapters of the Olympic saga. As the echoes of blade against ice slowly subside, and your eyelids gently drift towards slumber, hold close the promise of our next journey. we delve further into this frozen tapestry, uncovering knights and nobles of the rink's past. Ever guided by history's delightful glimmer, let us skate into the annals of history with Neria Zamboni in sight, to an era when the blades of ice skates were reportedly sharp enough to shave a woolly mammoth. Tonight, we glide effortlessly onto the ice of the early 20th century's Olympic skating scene. Picture it: frosty, wintry landscapes, and ladies just beginning to grace the rink, hemmed in by layers of modesty and, inconveniently, long skirts that doubled as velour snow shovels. In the early 1900s, figure skating was less about tossing one's body into a triple axel and more akin to the gentle art of surviving a gracefully controlled slide while twirling like a mildly exasperated ballerina. Considering the fact that rubber-soled shoes were still a modern luxury, it's a small wonder these pioneers managed to stay upright at all. At the onset, female skaters faced what could be described as just a smidgen of societal resistance. You might think these women, with their daring ice forays and dreams of gold medals, were greeted like noble trailblazers. But alas, the reception was colder than a winter breeze whispering through the alpine peaks. Society at the time maintained the belief that women were better suited for ice-encrusted ponds for decorative purposes, like the swans that kept company with eccentric heiresses, or perhaps for quietly fishing. Nevertheless, our brave skaters pressed on, carving their niche and track marks into history. Among these early skating daredevils was one Miss Madge Sayers. Ah, Madge, a name that rolls off the tongue like a British car rolling over black ice. Sayers was a trailblazer, the darling of the ice, and in 1902 she entered the figure skating competitions at the World Championships in London because, quite simply, there wasn't a rule explicitly telling her she couldn't. When asked why a woman dared trespass on such icy, male-dominated grounds, she might have replied with a glint in her eye, "Well, no one told me not to." Some gentlemen of the figure skating world were flabbergasted, not unlike the look you'd expect from a man slipping on an unexpected patch of frozen bananas, and were quite sure the ice would melt in the presence of a lady. But Sayers skated circles around the competition, literally, and came home with a sparkling second place, letting the slight omission of a gender-specific rule do the talking. The governing body, getting wind of their oversight, promptly and with a great deal of mustachioed harumphing, created a separate ladies' event. Nevertheless, Sayers had already carved her legacy and probably etched her initials into the rink. It wasn't long before the resilient spirit of women daring to define spin in a whole new way caught on like an elegantly choreographed yawn, and figure skating for women glimmered its way into the 1908 Olympic Games in London. This momentous occasion plopped female skaters onto the international ice stage under the not-so-gentle scrutiny of the world. Their skates, unnervingly thin and making fencing swords appear dull in comparison, carried them across the ice in tightly scripted performances that aimed to showcase elegance more than acrobatics. The uniform of choice at the time was questionable at best. It consisted of long skirts and tightly fitted bodices, creating a cheerfully draconian mix somewhere between Victorian outdoor wear and theatre curtain chic. Looking graceful, shapely, and paired with the ever-looming potential of slicing one's own hem, it was a fashion sensation to behold. But did these early Olympian women fear the ensemble? No more than a penguin fears a snowball fight. As the Olympic judges held their breaths, while discreetly keeping footwarmers nearby, women twirled through their routines, laying early groundwork for the skating feats we marvel at today. They leaped, albeit in ways that were occasionally reminiscent of startled woodland creatures, and spun with the grace as if the ice itself hummed them a lullaby. Each performance was a step forward in both sport and cultural equality, blades slicing tradition as deftly as they navigated the rink. They were the living proof that there was a different kind of power to be harnessed upon the ice. When combined with artistry, they turned mechanics into magic, much like the way an enchantress might have conjured snowflakes from the ether. And as they glided into history's pages, one couldn't help but lean back in their chair, sigh softly, and gaze at a sky yet to be pricked by stars. just as we silently thank these trailblazing women of the ice for their intrepid journeys into Olympic territory. Perhaps you too are feeling like a little plunge into restorative sleep. But before you drift away, sprinkled with dreams of gentle spins and graceful movements, remember that the night is young, and more stories of daring do await the telling. Swirling softly into the story, like a feather caught in a gentle breeze, we find ourselves on the icy paths of women's Olympic, skating at the dawn of the 20th century, an elegant yet treacherous dance of daring dames on blades as sharp as their wit. The scene is set with a gentle snowfall, each flake whispering tales of frostbitten endeavors and leaps of courage. Come close, dear listener, to the icy banks of Lake St. Moritz in Switzerland, where the winter air kisses the cheeks with a frosty blush. It's the early 1900s, and we are spectators to a seemingly quiet rebellion on the ice. Picture this. Beneath layers of woolen skirts, women athletes glided, not just across the frozen water, but through the rigid decorum of societal expectations. The costumes, oh, how they were both a delight and a dilemma. Dressed in elegant yet burdensome apparel, reminiscent of cross between a teapot cozy and a formal gown, these athletes were visually stunning, if not entirely aerodynamic. It's said that one of the early champions, Madame Sonia Henny, had an especially intricate wardrobe. Her costume might have doubled as a taxicab blinker with more sequins than a Gatsby gala. The task of integrating style with functionality was not merely sartorial, but a matter of survival. These women required both grace and grit as they embraced acrobatics akin to launching oneself from a trebuchet. Let's not forget the dastardly triple lutz, a move on par with jumping over a fence while maintaining the poise of sipping tea with the queen. In these formative competitions, the ice itself was a wild and unpredictable adversary. Unlike today's precision-engineered rinks, competitors of old-faced surfaces resembling a topographical map of the Alps, where a robust bump could launch your skates skyward as if channeling a spirited goat. Carving their way around these obstacles, skaters had to muster a skill set that could only be described as a serene yet stubborn negotiation with the laws of physics. Practice did not create merely perfect figure eights on the ice, but surreal renditions of a skater's unique brand of creative choreography, functions not always planned, but certainly memorable. Imagine spectators gasping, not because of a flawless pirouette, but perhaps in anticipation of a spectacular spill, their collective sigh forming frosty clouds in the alpine breeze. Ah, the judges, those sages of the scoreboard, sat in judgment not just of the presumed stunts on ice, but of the flavor of the individual flares. Poetry on blades, they often declared. They gazed with skeptical brows yet sparkling admiration as events unfolded, each performance a mosaic of athleticism arted with courage, ambition, and perhaps just a touch of madness. Technical challenges aside, being a female skater in these nascent days required a steely demeanor. Predominantly thought of as delicate damsels, these women warriors turned the ice stage into their battleground. Silently protesting the antiquated opinions of onlookers, they navigated the thin line between expected propriety and trailblazing thrill. The dynamic of elegance mixed with unyielding fortitude foreshadowed the revolution skating was destined to ignite. As we drift to the close of our chapter, let the echoing glide of skates settle within your somnolent thoughts, a reminder of a prelude to the graceful evolution of women's skating. In the shadowy weave of time itself, these elegant pioneers left behind tracks in the form of inspiration, carving paths for those who would follow. Now breathe softly and let these faint, enchanting melodies of history lull your spirit. Feel the gentle push of the whispering breeze, taking you toward the misted edges of sleep, where dreams may unveil yet another fascinating facet of our story's fabric in the twilight beyond this night. In the early 1900s, when corsets were as tightly laced as the societal norms that surrounded them, the adventurous women who dared to take to the ice for Olympic figure skating were about to embark on something both groundbreaking and slightly treacherous. These daring dames, wrapped in layers of wool and propriety, found themselves caught between grace and something resembling peril, all in the pursuit of Olympic glory. Imagine, if you will, standing on the frozen pond of fame, clutching your skates and trying to keep your balance, both literally and socially. The podia of these early Olympics weren't just about athletic prowess, but a feat of courage in the face of rather comical adversity. As Dorothy Douglas, a mythical figure skater of this era, would tell it if she were here, likely while sipping on a steaming cup of chamomile tea, learning a three-turn wearing what amounted to an elegant, moving sofa cover wasn't for the faint-hearted. Visions of elegance had to wrestle with the reality of layers upon layers of thick clothing needed to keep them from freezing into human popsicles. Yet, our daring athletes twirled, leapt, and occasionally had a polite lie down on the ice, known today as falling. But let's keep the drama minimal for bedtime's sake. The hazards didn't end with the attire. Enter the fearless competition between women who, by today's standards, skated in coordination akin to a dance of wobbly penguins, elegantly fighting the elements. This was not the climate-controlled, freshly Zambonied arena ice we know today. No. Here, the surface resembled something more like the studded expanse of a cratered moon than a sheet of glass. Potholes, bumps, and the occasional rogue snowdrift made it anyone's guess if they'd finish their routine upright. Dorothy, forever the optimist, knew all too well the trials of such a stage. Her debut at the inaugural ladies' singles competition at the 1908 London Olympics was nothing short of a comedy of errors. The weather had played its tricks, presenting a particularly brisk breeze that sent her careening toward the judges, nearly chaplet first. Not one to be outdone by nature, she styled it out with a flourish, giving the audience, who were mostly bundled and huddled for warmth, a performance so arrestingly unpredictable, one newspaper dubbed it an exuberant interpretation of the northern wind. Perhaps one of the most whimsical spectacles of the time was the propensity for wild, albeit unintended, improvisation. During one event, Helga from the German contingent set out with dreams of an axel jump, not unlike today's single axels, but perhaps more akin to a gloriously miscalculated pirouette. The jump started with a valiant attempt at takeoff, only to be thwarted by what can only be described as gravitational redundancy, accompanied by the sound of wool-meeting ice. The appreciative and forgiving crowd simply loved a good show, and so this unhappy accident quickly turned into a signature move dubbed the Helga Spin. Slight bruising aside, it became the tale of innovation under icy duress, captivating everyone's imagination. Indeed, our trailblazers weren't just mastering the ice. They were skating into the annals of history with an enchanting mix of whimsy and determination. As snowflakes softly piled up like secret messages from the skies, they danced on this frosty canvas, inspired more by dreams than technique, filling the night with glimmers of courage and laughter. And so, the stage of early women's Olympic skating was one of budding dreams, comedic tumbles, and earnest attempts at elegance. A place where the vast dollop of unpredictability was the special guest at every performance. As stars twinkled over wintry skies, flickering lights on a restless world, our champions skated on, unknowingly chiseling their names into the icy marble of Olympic legend. Let us glide onward, now gently onward, still warmed by the glow of history's whimsical theatre, and softly await where our story may drift next. Picture this, a sprawling sheet of ice, glistening under the timid sun of a winter's day, somewhere in a chilly corner of the early 20th century. Imagine the devout skaters, each of them bundled up in as many layers as their spindly, frail legs can manage, like some kind of woolen corset onion. The air is crisp, filled with anticipation and the occasional whiff of liniment. Welcome, dear listener, to the perilous, and often unintentionally comedic, world of early women's Olympic skating. Now, the spectators gathered around these icy spectacles probably did not expect to witness quite so many unexpected sittings in the snow. But as fate would have it, the early 1900s was a golden era for such accidental demonstrations. with skating outfits that appeared to have been designed by someone who had never actually seen a person skate. The ladies of the rink were veritably daring to defy physics, modesty, and the odd stray squirrel that decided to scuttle across the ice. The outfits of choice were all about elegance and supreme nobility in motion. A long skirt, graciously sweeping over the surface, with the subtlety and grace we might associate with a well-fed swan. What this meant, in reality, was that more often than not, our athletes might find themselves tangled in their own garments, more intricately than any cat in a ball of yarn. Yes, these fashion choices were about as purpose-built for speed and agility as a pair of ladles are for going fishing. However, beyond the sartorial snafus, early Olympic skating was a bona fide showcase of skill, bravery, and the occasional impromptu interpretive dance where a spin might end in a more avant-garde pose than intended. You see, before the era of gleaming metal skates, perfectly engineered for glaive-like gliding, skaters danced their ballet on blades that could be charitably described as looking like they might have been borrowed from a blacksmith's toolkit. The sport consisted less of triple axels and double flips, and more of innovative attempts to stay upright and maintain some semblance of balance, which, as any early skater could attest, was a feat worthy of applause. Our brave skaters performed in open-air environments, at the mercy of fickle weather patterns. Snow might decide to flutter gently, covering the ice in a powdery layer as if to challenge our skaters to a game of hide-and-seek. On particularly challenging days, the faces of intrepid young skaters would emerge from beneath their hats with a faint blush, equal parts cold wind and rosy anticipation of their grand escapades across the ice. On the brightest of days, with sunlight glancing from a million diamond fractures along the ice, the arena transformed into a veritable theatre for the brave heroines daring the elements. It's worth noting the alternative discipline of skating that was quite literally a side gig for some. And I do mean side gig, for these athletes would occasionally find themselves gliding sideways completely unintentionally. This was, of course, the art of interpretive skating, a curious realm where skaters paired their leaping and spinning prowess with a dramatic facial flourish that suggested they were both thrilled and somewhat baffled by their own sheer audacity. Amidst the laughter and the flurries, and a few bumps and glances with spontaneously animated snowbanks, there were truly remarkable moments of serendipitous success. The times when the stars aligned, the skates obeyed their master's commands, and in an icy waltz of sheer tenacity, early female skaters carved history on ice, becoming stories whispered in warm, cozy tones just outside the rink. As we pause now on this serene note, the soft glide of blades across frozen waters, gently pulling at the eyelids, let's drift into the dreams of yesteryear's heroines of the ice, their tales of daring, as smooth and soft as the lull between skates on pristine ice, linger on the cusp of memory. Ready for more tales of daring dozy folklore? Fear not, for as we float on this sleepy sea, there yet lies another in the snow-dusted horizon of our dreamy journey. Ah, the glamorous world of early women's Olympic figure skating, a realm twinkling with glacial elegance and the whispered dangers of gold-plated ambition. Picture, if you will, the serene yet precarious stage upon which our velvet-clad heroines danced, or more accurately, skidded, tracing dizzying loops of both victory and mishap. In those formative decades of the Winter Olympic Games, the scene was set not in the modern indoor ice rinks we know today, all perfectly chilled and plexiglass wrapped, but in the more rustic arenas of outdoor lakes and makeshift ice patches, seemingly conjured up as if Mother Nature was in a particularly forgetful phase and had just remembered about winter. Yes, before the hum of Zambonis and the scent of popcorn on icy air, figure skaters had to contend with a different breed of hazards. But let me not baffle you with trifles of frost. Instead, let's glide gracefully back to the 1920s. Our story for this chapter finds roots curling back to the 1924 Winter Olympics in Chamonix, France. Picture the biographies of lady skaters of old, much like gripping novels of courage, suspense, and questionable taste in fingerless mittens. Enter Sonja Henie, a Norwegian ever on a mission whose zest for skating started while she was hardly more than a toddler. By 8, she was terrorizing ice patches across Europe, and by 11, she had maneuvered her way onto the Olympic stage, becoming the youngest figure skater in the game's history. Sonia had a certain chutzpah, or that je ne sais quoi, as the locals might say, though one imagines their inflections are tempered slightly by tongue-numbing cold. Her routines were like poetry in motion, except imagine if the poet was occasionally mugged by an icebound haiku thief. Bearing silk skirts and unrelenting smiles, Sonia danced her way into the hearts of many a spectator. And yet, beneath this elegance, an unspoken reality lingered. Figure skating, for all its beauty, was peppered with peril. The ice, you see, was a formidable foe. Unlike the industrial, smooth-faced rinks of today, early Olympic ice was at best unreliable. One might walk onto the slick sheen expecting a theatrical ballet, only to find a stage resistant to one's pirouetting aspirations. Skaters would set their blades like ancient explorers, keenly studying this mysterious white map beneath them. Watch them dance upon a baptism of ice chips and shattered courage. This chapter wouldn't do justice without acknowledging the true, silent nemesis, the judges. Those connoisseurs of icebound artistry, with pencils sharp enough to carve through dreams and scores that were bitingly subjective. Judges in those halcyon days were captivated by classic lines and balletic disciplines. The Triple Axel wasn't even a glimmer in the imagined eyes yet. But one suspects that even then, they found sleep slightly elusive, serenaded by the symphony of whispers, an ethereal reminder that human interpretations could turn beloved talents to naught. The comical secret, as you savor this somnolent story, is that while the audience always saw the pristine show, the skaters themselves knew of another scene, a slapstick world where ice was occasionally partnered with unplanned acrobatics. Chancing upon wobbles under pristine snow-coated audiences, some skaters learned to blend unplanned pratfalls with cleverly rehearsed choreography, all wrapped up in sparkles and shared with only the ice as mute witness. Yet, through the brilliantly polished surface, a different kind of competition simmered. Women skaters had to demonstrate perseverance where society, ice conditions, and sometimes common sense advised otherwise. Their steely determination was a kind of third rail, quiet, unseen, and vital to the locomotion of the sport. Even as we slip towards the conclusion of our chapter, picture Sonia and her compatriots. These skating vixens of valor, who defied not only gravity but also the conventions of their time. Their glacial art drifting upon the stage of history, destined to evolve into the sophisticated spectacle that leaves us spellbound today. As we glide gently towards our next adventure, imagine the soft rustle of applause fading, the delicate crunch of snow beneath hand-sewn boots softening to nothing. Visualize the skaters in some pleasant place beyond time, curtsying to history as they prepare for the next graceful leap into posterity. But fear not, dear listener, for the ice holds many secrets yet to be unveiled. Stay tuned for our next chapter, where we'll explore yet another cool retro revelation of the Olympic Games gone by. Sweet dreams await, somewhere twixt the frost and dreams of our elegant past. As the first decade of the 1900s twirled into view, the promising new world of figure skating was host to a peculiar cast of characters, of which the women athletes were as much adventurers as they were competitors. With a backdrop of corsets and constraints, these pioneering skaters dare to don a pair of slightly rusted steel blades and take to the ice where danger did not just lurk, it brazenly pirouetted at every slip and slide. Let us pause and see this scene. The year 1908 London and the Summer Olympic Games are hosting the world's first women's figure skating competition. Yes, you heard it right. Women in summer, skating on freshly frozen ice, buffed to treacherous perfection. The arena was a melting pot of grinning onlookers and wide-eyed aristocrats, each clutching onto woolen muffs while pondering if they too might ever swirl in public without fainting from either exertion or modesty. Imagine, if you will, the courageous scholar-turned-skater, Madge Sayers. Few could match her grace, and fewer still dared to. With husband Edgar as her trusty ice valet, Sayers was the living definition of the early women's figure skating connoisseur. Witnessing Sayers take to the ice, you might have thought the ethereal gliding movement was some divine blessing rather than the product of months spent communing with ice skates that could easily double as cheese slicers. But these ventures weren't entirely without peril. The smooth path to victory was less clear-cut, shadowed by the icy perils that laid in wait. In that era, the act of preparing the ice itself was an evolutionary stage away from hauling ice blocks straight out of Edwardian drinks coolers. A hapless Zamboni predecessor might have merely been a diligent groundskeeper, tickled as much to his core by cold drafts as he was to shivering precision. While Madge Sayers pirouetted, threading gracefully through the frigid London air, other brave souls found themselves in rather more slippery scenarios. Picture a scene where a young novice skater bravely attempted the then state-of-the-art one-foot spin, but instead unintentionally executed the heralded but still unchristened move of a reverse potato chip. This involved the entirety of one's dignity being temporarily unattended as all four limbs engaged the ice in an unexpectedly synchronized snow angel formation. Official rules were scarce, which left a great deal to the interpretation of common sense, a currency sometimes in short supply. One popular style among the early competitors was the hems and corsets, a delicate dance of agility that was, in truth, a frantic battle between retaining poise and relinquishing it to gravity. The resultant spectacle was a fusion betwixt ballet and a kettle drum, as falls were often as memorable as feats. To spectators, these early matches might have seemed more a frosty debating society than an Olympic sport. Judges calmly debated over terms yet undefined, while athletes performed with a daring uncertain of what any performance might yield. Still, amidst all the slapstick humanity and earnest dedication, those early ice queens offered a perpetual gift. In their audacity and adventure, they paved the icy path toward the enchanting figure skating spectacles we swoon over. Today, the ones that blend beauty and precision with the ease of a spring mink gliding effortlessly over morning ice. Now, as the twilight of this chapter gently recedes, imagine these early skating pioneers leaving the arena, laughter interwoven with chatter, distant dreams of triple axels not yet dreamt. Perhaps a few stray snowflakes float down, whispers of history landing softly as the narrative awaits its next graceful turn. So lean back, rest your thoughts upon the pillow of night, and drift softly. Another chapter of this Olympic tale unfurls when you're ready to dream further. Imagine, if you will, a crisp, wintry day in the early years of the 20th century, a world freshly brushing off the cobwebs of the Victorian era and stepping gingerly into the modern age. And what a world it was for the brave women of early Olympic figure skating, venturing forth onto frosty arenas with a mix of elegance and sheer audacity. Picture a scene of graceful skaters, clad in woolen garments more suited for surviving Antarctic expeditions than executing elegant twirls and spins. As onlookers shivered from the frosty air, and perhaps from the anticipation of any of these courageous athletes executing a gravity-defying leap, our heroines navigated their way through routines, balancing on what seemed little more than elongated sewing needles. The sport today includes a triple axel, but back then, it might better have been called the triple exposure, one to frostbite, another to embarrassment after a spectacular spill, and yet a third to the hazards of unsteady ice. Among those stalwart skaters was Madge Sayers, a name that glided into the history books as smoothly as her skate did across the ice. Competing in 1908, Sayers took to the ice at the London Olympics, teasingly pooh-poohing the notion that women ought to stick to stationary pursuits. Madge not only competed, she conquered, claiming the gold amidst the huffing and puffing of those who doubted that women's legs were as suited for spirals as they were for standing at socials. While today's skaters twinkle brightly with sequined costumes, back then they could only dream of such luxuries under layers of thick wool and pom-pommed hats, which added an extra layer of difficulty to their endeavors. The skaters' attempts to implement style and grace were punctuated with frequent stops to avoid the lurking hazards on the rink, a strategically unfrozen crack here, perhaps an adventurous squirrel disguised as debris there. You see, these early rinks were open-air marvels, dependent entirely on cooperative weather. Crisp and crystalline mornings were welcomed, but one sigh of a sunbeam could transform a perfectly chilled surface into a treacherous river of slush. Not that this deterred our heroines, who, once upon that rough and ready ice, uncorked performances ripe with daring double twizzles and sharp swoops, all fueled by an indomitable spirit and a piquant anticipation of their post-skate in cloaked layers, peering with steely gazes through monocles fogged with the breath of intrigue and winter chill. They looked for precision, poise, and pout, unbeknownst to them, inventing the precursor to the duckface selfie. Yet there was as much admiration as skepticism, and the judges' scores were delivered with a stoic solemnity, even when the ice beneath them began to show suspicious signs of decay. Another early star was Helga Eriksson, the Swedish belle who skated onto the scene like a snowflake. If that snowflake was particularly tenacious and ready to stun. Her presence on the rink was a study in both intensity and ingenuity, as though someone had whispered to her, "Helga, dear, always remember, the rink is less a surface than it is a stage," which she took quite literally, replete with dramatic gestures and swooning finishes that would, one day, inspire films about the ice-cold world of competitive skating. As the afternoon fades into dusk and our focus shifts gently away from the climb and clatter of these early figure skating champs, perhaps you'll find your eyes feeling a tad heavier, your world a bit more vivid with color and movement, as though you've glimpsed a pastel vignette of a wintry past. Drift now, and ponder how far sporting courage and chutzpah have taken these daring ladies across the gulf of time. Only a dreamer can chart what awaits them next, as whispers of future victories begin to twinkle in the frosty air of history's rink. In the late 19th century, a riveting spectacle unfurled at the confluence of Victorian elegance and early women's Olympic skating, a sport teetering as much on the precipice of danger as on the cutting edge of newly invented skate blades. Picture it, Victorian skirts swirling madly like plumage in an elaborate avian ritual, with layers of petticoats cascading down to the frozen dance floor. At the heart of this curious performance was not just the grace of the skaters, but the very invention of a hovering danger they were poised upon. As the story goes, these early skates were far from what you might now recognize as state-of-the-art footwear. Oh no, these were more akin to medieval torture devices than modern athletic gear. Fashioned from stout wood and fire-forged iron, the skates of the time were inspired by those once donned by Dutch canal skaters. The unforgiving metal blades often exhibited a certain reluctance to stay attached to shoes, and any wobble at the wrong angle might incite an impromptu removal, leaving a skater with one blaze ready for ice and the other off on a leisure break. Olympic skating, therefore, was less a poised display of athleticism and more a rugged test of one's tenacity and improvisation. Graceful triple axels and salchows were but twinkles in the ambitious eyes of future skaters. Instead, this era featured its own radical maneuvers, the desperate lunge for balance, the surprise swoop of the petticoat, and the ever-thrilling, elegant controlled fall, which, much like a comedic pratfall, required as much talent to perform convincingly without apparent injury. Underneath this picturesque facade of dandily gliding women lay the disquieting reality of frozen lakes and rivers, the skating rinks of choice at the time. Natural ice was a fickle partner, more temperamental than a royal courtier with a grudge. Skaters were known to assess the suitability of these arenas through the age-old method of stomping one's boot in godly defiance against the ice. There were tales aplenty of daring women who had taken a rather too close inspection beneath the surface, coming head-to-head with the unanticipated chill and the gentle nibble of fishes, curious about their new visitors from above. Behind velvet curtains at tea-time discussions, whispers of potential catastrophes were sometimes met with a tantalizing combination of disdain and admiration. To be an early female Olympian skater was to be walking a slender and rather slippery line between lauded public thrill and private peril. Then there were the onlookers, those captivated souls huddled at the edge of icy venues, bundled in layers more voluminous than a Dickensian novella. They came not only for the entertainment, but for the marvel of scientific inquiry. Cold weather mixing with the allure of Victorian societal norms sliding atop impossibly thin ice. While the skaters may have risked life and limb in their feats, spectators braved the gusty debates over whether women belonged on the ice at all, quite disregarding the fact that women had been skating circles around them for years, both literally and in terms of spirited dialogue. With each blossom of success came stumbling mishaps, and herein lay the charm, you see. A dance like no other, stitching together elements of elegance, danger, and improbable innovation. Yet it was this uncertain cocktail that kept the dawn of women's Olympic skating brimming with beautiful unpredictability. As the snow fell gently on those frozen lakes, muffling the laughs and gasps of the expectant crowd, there was a whisper of change in the air, like the gentle susurration of a silk sleeve against a beaded bodice. And so, as the candlestick flames flickered low, casting mellow golden glows around rooms warmly alight with sleepy anticipation, a tender point of curiosity formed. What might the future hold for these hardy trailblazers of ice? What twists, turns, and inventions lay just around the frosty corner? A gentle breeze, the harbinger of unknown adventures, wafted through the open-windowed minds of those nestled in bed, wrapping them in a blanket of dreams of skates and snowflakes. And as the lulling rhythm of history continued its soothing narration, we find ourselves gently drifting onward, a soft segue into the secrets yet to unfold in the icy ballet of Olympic legacy. The enticing world of early women's Olympic skating, a time when the sport was closer to a perilous dance with destiny than the graceful exhibitions we see today. Picture yourself in a frosty Edwardian wonderland where skirts ran long, blades were wild, and the only triple anything going on involved the number of layers fashionable ladies wore to stay warm. Seriously, keeping cozy while carving up the ice was an Olympic event in itself. In the early 1900s, figure skating was a sophisticated affair, much like hosting your local garden club under Arctic conditions. The sport made its Olympic debut at the 1908 London Games, and just 3 charismatic women dared to step onto the ice with the confidence of debutantes and the courage of daredevils. These were the trailblazers, serenely gliding across the rink while hoping not to showcase an impromptu interpretation of an ice swan dive. Magda Julin, a Swedish skating queen with a charmingly nonchalant air, was among these pioneers. Now Magda was no stranger to the perils of the pastime. Indeed, she was the kind of woman who would manage a gracious curtsy even after landing flat on her posterior, a skill, I dare say, can elude even the finest of us today. Legend has it, Magda once quipped that skating actually helped her perfect her artful tumble. One can only imagine the poise it took to embrace such a glamorous fall as part of her routine, much like accepting that extra cake slice at a tea party when not truly hungry, but always determinedly polite. Then there was Dorothy Greenhow-Smith, a British competitor with the elegant heart of a noblewoman, and perhaps the balance slightly more akin to someone who mysteriously misplaced it. Dorothy delighted audiences with her graceful routines, but her landings? Well, let's just say they occasionally required a bit of improvisation. Much like maneuvering a wayward umbrella on a windy English day, she deftly maneuvered obstacles most would deem a recipe for a spectacular slip and fall. And who could forget Helene Engelmann, the eagle of Austro-Hungary on blades? Helene was a lithe and agile athlete, known for her somehow charming pivot from dazzling performer to intrepid ice scientist, testing the limits of momentum, gravity, and cold, hard surfaces alike. Helene approached the ice like a theatrical stage, wowing audiences with routines that seemed to say, "I don't always tumble into a pile of fluff, but when I do, I win gold." While elegance was paramount, the skaters of yore also faced tangible, chilling dangers, not least the weather itself, which determinedly conspired to make Olympic venues feel more like frosty fortresses than friendly forums for sport. The unheated indoor rinks often had all the warmth and ambience of an icebox set to freezer zeal. But did our heroines complain? Of course not. They defied frostbite with smiles so bright they practically melted the ice they worked upon. After all, a shivering chin could ruin a winning smile. Beyond the battles against elements and gravity, early skating also demanded navigating a flurry of intricate social rules. Proper etiquette dictated that ladies gliding on ice should avoid any unbecoming displays, including what we now call a glorious mid-air spin. The Triple Axel, as we know it, was but a fantastical dream, for our early competitors were tasked with a far more delicate feat, ice skating, while preserving a sense of impeccably graceful decorum and, quite likely, without spilling the high society equivalent of a perfectly balanced cup of imaginary tea. As you lay cocooned in your cozy shelter, dreaming about these early Olympians who swirled and twirled against the odds, remember that each glide and stumble laid the foundation for the gravity-defying feats witnessed today. Perhaps there's a wee bit of tiredness tapping at your eyelids now, as gently as each pioneer patting the ice to reassure their skates to please behave. And so, let your mind drift comfortably into a realm where skates whisper secrets to the ice, and every fall is a fragment of history masked with a smile. And speaking of delightful falls, next we shall find ourselves in the midst of a charming tale where even the tiniest slip could become an unexpected part of a synchronized duet. Glide with me, dear listener, into the glittering, icy corridors of the early 20th century, when women's Olympic skating was an exhilarating blend of elegance and rather daring danger. There's something both comical and endearing about the thought of genteel ladies, more accustomed to the drawing room, attempting triple axels, though admittedly less axel and more triple tumble. Picture it, graceful figures draped in layers of flowing fabric, not quite the lycra of today, but rather more reminiscent of your great-grandmother's Sunday best. These ankle-length dresses were all the rage, perfect for tea parties, not so much for a spin across a freshly frosted, our rink. Every jump required skill and a secret hope that their hemlines wouldn't betray them to the cold kiss of the ice. Hence, our brave early skaters resembled a flock of elegant, albeit slightly confused swans, trying to remember if they were supposed to dance or swim. In these pioneering icy arenas, rinks were often more pockmarked than pristine, like a giant had used them for a particularly aggressive round of marbles. Imagine a freshly cut natural ice rink at the mercy of Mother Nature, with a surface that could be rather more like a lunar landscape than the polished expanses we admire today. Oh, the tales these jagged surfaces could tell, of heroic leaps that ended in grandeur, or the occasional unintended snowbath. Our protagonists, the daring dames of this nascent sport, performed under conditions that could be best described as brisk. Bitter winds flapped skirts with a mischief that seemed almost sentient. The chill air did its best to sear their lungs with every ambitious pirouette, sending them both breathless and exhilarated. But our daring heroines had their secrets. They sewed pockets into their costumes to tuck away handkerchiefs. Yes, hankies, to dry their brow, and occasionally their pride after a particularly enthusiastic kiss with the ice. These brave women came garlanded not just in their layered costumes, but also in the charming eccentricities of the time. Take, for instance, one such trailblazer, Madge Sayers. Her Olympic dreams were nearly foiled by that most bureaucratic absurdity, a rulebook. You see, the early organizers of figure skating had simply assumed all competitors would be men. But Madge, never one for limitations, challenged this notion with both citizenly persistence and an admirable disregard for traditional boundaries. Her inclusion required a rather hasty edit to the rules, effectively turning skating into the stride from exclusion to gender equality, all done with the elegance of a dainty backward toe loop. Despite the frosty temperatures, the crowds came bundled and cheering, drawn like moths to a frozen flame. A gathering of top hats and mufflers, these rapturous audiences watched in awe. Or perhaps it was sheer disbelief, as these female skaters launched themselves heavenward with that thrilling, albeit wobbly trajectory. Even amid the laughter-inducing mishaps, though, camaraderie reigned supreme. On those unpredictable rinks, competitors became companions, sharing tips on technique and the best secret remedies for inevitable bruises. Hot chocolate and ginger concoctions flowed as freely as the laughs over dinner tables, where tales of that day's exploits were embellished to Olympian proportions. And so, our tale meanders through time, amid feats and frosty adventures, where the tip-tap of skates on ice set rhythmic punctuation to our narration. As you drift into slumber, imagine yourself curling into a gentle spin with these valiant ladies, where time and motion slow into a serene lullaby of history's most graceful waltz. The icy stage is set, my dear listener. Join me again as we glide on, exploring even the revelations of those who dared tread lightly where the ice was thinnest, as we drift peacefully into the world of eerie yet enchanting early Olympic skating. Let us cast a knowing glance at a time when the ice rink was as treacherous as a slippery diplomatic meeting in the snow with zero traction footwear. This charming, albeit perilous era of women's skating was a heady blend of grace, talent, and a liberal splattering of audacious bravado. Picture, if you will, the scene. The early 1900s, when ladies donned ankle-length skirts that could easily double as sleds in a snowstorm and hats so wide they could host an entire tea service. Into this frosty setting of Yuletide fashion tragedy entered the true pioneers of women's skating, fearless individuals with the spirit of adventure and skirts that doubled as secret compartments for all things miscellaneous, including, rumor has it, the occasional cat. Balance was key, and not just because one false move could find a skater buried beneath a landslide of woolen knits. Skaters of the time would glide over barely frozen lakes, accompanied by the constant threat of a particularly unhelpful crack echoing from beneath. It was a time when a graceful swan dive could become an unintentional bath in the blink of an eye, or in the case of our skaters, the flutter of an eyelash under several layers of protective fabric. One noteworthy heroine of the ice was Madge Syers, an Englishwoman who skated her way into history with the kind of nonchalance that suggests a life spent artfully dodging tax collectors, or at least particularly aggressive geese. In an era where men ruled the ice, Madge commandeered their domain with her own brand of finesse and an award-winning smile. In 1902, she dared enter a world championship open to gentlemen, simply because, apparently, the rules neglected to mention that all skaters must have a penchant for moustaches and a burning passion for monocles. Her second-place finish was a rebellious little tap dance on the ice of gender conventions, and it left everyone reeling with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. Madge's triumph opened the gates of competitive ice skating to women, although these gates were more like barely shackled fences ready to fling open with the slightest encouragement. Following Syers, women laced up with a curiosity that could only be surpassed by cats inspecting an empty box. Suddenly, the ice rink became a canvas upon which tales of elegance and audacity could be seamlessly woven together with the occasional muffled curse when the artistry collided with the unyielding reality of gravity. And speaking of tales, we cannot forget about the mildly explosive debut of Sonja Henie, a Norwegian Spitfire who swept the icy paths of the 1928 Olympics with a grin that had thawing powers. Picture Sonja, petite, with the sass of 1,000 seagulls who have just successfully stolen your fish and chips. She pioneered the short-skirted revolution of the skating world, thus allowing her leg muscles to be seen and admired, while promptly sending traditionalists into a tizzy of disapproval and gasps intense enough to chill any hot cocoa within earshot. Henie's heartstring-tugging routines, seasoned with spins so brisk they mirrored whirlwinds conjured by a highly caffeinated wizard, left audiences dazzled and delighted. Her success announced itself like Sunday morning church bells, paving the way for shorter skirts and even more dazzling moves on the ice, as well as sparking an arms race of sequins and rhinestones that continues to glitter through to this day. Yet for all the glamour and gliding prowess, Those early days were decorated with the occasional minor slip, a miscalculated slide through the proverbial looking glass into Wonderland's more embarrassing corners. The dirndl skirts of their competitive outfits were notoriously capricious, at times deciding to act independently of their wearers' wishes, leading to moments that were more comedy of errors than ballet of elegance. As you let these tales of chilly heroics sink in like a comforting hot drink on a cold night, imagine the galaxies of sparkling ice, each quiet crack an echo of the past triumphs and tumbles. With your eyelids growing heavy, perhaps they'll conjure a dreamland where the altitudes of acrobatics thrive unperturbed by the boundaries of stitched seams and frozen whims. And so, as the ice drifts gently into the realm of dreams, let us prepare to uncover another glistening shard of history and ponder the peculiar genius of the ladies who skated both past and beyond the usual bounds, with a smile for every snowflake or stumble, setting the scene in a quieter, simpler time when the Olympic Winter Games were more of a wildly unpredictable circus than the streamlined spectacle we know today. Envision the early 20th century, a time when women stepped onto the icy battleground, skates in hand, ready to twist, turn, and occasionally tumble, full of hope, grit, and maybe just a smidge of good-natured chaos. Imagine, if you will, that you're on a vast, frozen lake, somewhere in the wintry heart of Europe, the stage set for the aristocratic sport of figure skating. The air is crisp enough to bite, but still sweet, like an invigorating slap from Mother Nature herself. The year just shy of 1924, the year when women's figure skating would make its grand entree into the Olympic roster, reserved in its inaugural Parisian glory for the Summer Olympics when they were first introduced. But it wasn't until the frothy, snow-clad slopes of Chamonix welcomed the Winter Games that women's figure skating glided, twirled, and wobbled onto the scene. Picture the competitors, a medley of figures bundled in gowns of grace and impossibility, resembling elegant, moving snowdrifts topped with gently shedding tufts of hat feathers. Cumbersome, you might say, but charming, like being wrapped snugly in a well-loved quilt made of dreams and assorted woolens. The ice, however, could be ruthless, with injuries not romanticized as mere splatters of snow gracefully adorning one's knees, but instead looming like sculptors' tools ready to carve missteps into solidifying cautionary tales. Old Man Time moved slower back then. Even his pace could be measured in leisurely glides, subtle as a late-night crescendo hitting its sweet, silent lull. Grace and execution were judged against a backdrop of roaring silence, save for an occasional call of encouragement, doubtless muddled by frozen breath clouds, a ghostly chorus of murmured cheerfulness. The audience clung to the peripheries, bundled up against the cold, their eyes taking in the splendid spectacle with genuine awe. Imagine Jane Torville and Christopher Dean, time-traveling on unsteady skates, wherein their bolero encore might have resembled less a symphonic dream and more a vintage slapstick skit. A single skater enters the rink. Sonja Henie, youthful and steeled for the occasion, a daring Norwegian with blades not quite forged from the same resilience as steel. Wobble by wobble, Henie was learning how to transform potential floor ornaments into a collection of invisible medals, even insomuch as the simple acts of standing and moving forward were triumphs to treble with applause. Skaters like Henie overcame challenges set against a most unyielding and often unfriendly ice. It seemed, in luminous moments of clarity, a fragile dance more determined by the laces on one's skates than the skill or the heart they possessed. Skaters teetered between elegance and calamity. A thin line separated poignancy from pathos, confidence from calamity, magic in their lines, patience in their timing. And as history unfurled, the practice arenas birthed not only champions but inventors of creative skating, flops, unconventional choreography shaped by gravity's unchecked whims. Those early Olympians showcased moves that would make modern coaches turn paler than the Borscht Belt. Consider the shuffle, a rustic, homespun signature where each skater, feathered and fearless, elected to seamlessly mix hesitant foot-gliding movements with the icy embrace of the earth itself. But such journeys are seldom solitary. As legend would have it, the camaraderie formed within the rigid embrace of winter ice was one as tangling as the inevitable spiderweb of skater scarves and twizzle turns into dream-inducing swirls. Despite the kinetic courtships, with gravity pulling rebels to the ground, the whispers between them held tales of trespasses overcome, a tapestry woven of determination spun against the frosty breath of real challenges. With each fall and rise, giggle and gasp, they twirled their way into history, leaving behind not just marks of their existence on the pitiless frozen lakes, but seeds that would someday echo into what we would gleefully declare as records at Triple Axel revolutions. With such sleep-ready sagacity spun into their trials, we glide onward, unknowingly preparing ourselves to unfold more tales, the frigid masks wove into silk-lined history books. But as the icy imprint of our dreams curls around us like a white-capped quilt stitched with resilience, we remember there are more stories, all as restless as the wind, waiting patiently on the other side of slumber's embrace. As the winter winds swirled around the ancient Viennese streets, let's imagine a quaint little cafe, curious and cozy, nestled beneath the comforting layers of snow. This is where our story unfolds on a rather surprising page of Olympic history, where ice skating was not as graceful as a swan's glide on a serene pond, but more akin to enthusiastic yet wobbly ducklings trying to do ballet. The star of the show, a brave woman by the name of Madge Sayers who, back in 1902, decided it was high time we sprinkled some feminine flair onto the ice. At that point, the concept of women competing in what was dubbed men's skating was about as expected as finding a penguin in your breakfast cereal. But Madge, with a spark in her eye and frost in her hair, took to the ice anyway and skated circles around the competition at the World Championships, earning a remarkable second place. This was a monumental event, akin to watching your cat conduct a symphony, both unexpected and wonderfully entertaining. As the tale of Madge Sayers melted into the annals of history, the Olympic committees, in a burst of rational thought, or perhaps they just had some delightful tea, finally allowed women their place on the Olympic ice in 1908. Well, not entirely onto the ice. They allowed women to skate gracefully alongside male partners, delicately balancing athleticism and that particular charm only seen in duets, as they performed in pair skating. But do not be fooled. Pair skating was not without its dandy dramas. Oh no, it had its own brand of spicy brilliance. Early pairs conjured up spins and lifts that I'm confident were choreographed straight from the delightful chaos of a runaway carousel. One particularly ambitious routine involved tossing one's partner into the air as though auditioning for a circus act. Yet gravity had a way of reminding everyone that what goes up must definitely, and often unceremoniously, come down. It was these moments on the rink when skaters flirted with disaster that really allowed the imagination to wander. Every spin carried a whiff of what might have been a close shave, while every lift was followed by a heart-stopping moment when you weren't quite sure if landing safely was part of the plan, yet it often was. But what a thrill it was to watch. Spectators, snug in their furs and sipping hot cocoa, marveled at the elasticity of limbs and balance. So much balance. A balance of beauty and a precarious teeter between grace and calamity. And thus, the fantastical world of women's Olympic figure skating was born, a realm where dreams danced upon the ice with no shortage of endearing mishaps. Yet, as the rinks became smoother and the skaters more audacious in their pursuits, a quiet revolution began to twinkle like frost on a window pane. It wasn't just about gliding effortlessly across a frozen canvas. No, indeed. It was about inventing moves so daring they might just steal the breath right out of an unsuspecting audience member. Those early skaters weren't just gliding. They were pioneering the art of spinning and leaping so loftily, stars might be envious. Oh, the possibilities were endless as they spun themselves into history, each revolution marking a slow waltz into the glories and challenges to come. With each daring feat, the rink evolved from a flat stage of potential embarrassment into a theater of dazzling dreams, all encapsulated in the bravery of each leap into the unknown. And so, as the chilly Viennese night wore on, our cafe's window lightly frosted over, this gentle, icy ballet stretched into a rhythmic ode to the early days of women's figure skating at the Olympics, a nostalgic nod from a fascinating past that invites us to dive deeper into the enchanting tale of balancing on blades, caught between historical whimsy and the courage to dream. As sleep gently beckons, prepare to nestle a bit further beneath the warm veneer of time, where the unexpected twists of history, choreographed with charm and skill, continue to twirl through the timeless dance of the past and future alike. As the new dawn of the 1920s swept across a post-war world eager for jubilance and fresh starts, the enchanted ice rinks of Europe and North America began to witness something truly remarkable. Women spinning and gliding with such artistic grace, it was as if they were painting the frozen waters with dreams. These early figure skaters, armed with nothing more than their tightly laced skates, layers of woolen attire, and a sprinkle of chutzpah, embarked on a swirling journey that would subtly nudge the world of sports into a new age. This chapter of our cozy slumber narrative meanders into the dainty world of ladies' figure skating, a peculiar sport that, at its budding inception, seemed more like a gentle ballet on ice than the gravity-defying spectacle it would one day become. We find ourselves amidst the bustling scene of the 1924 Winter Olympics, the first ever of its kind, nestled in the charming alpine commune of Chamonix, France. The local cafes buzzed with eager spectators sipping steaming mugs of chocolate chaud, their breath mingling with the crisp mountain air. Among these enthralled visitors sat many audacious young women, primed to etch their icy marks into Olympic history, some without even knowing they had forgotten to pack their skates. The early Olympic skating scene was a portrayal of elegance, with a dash of bonkers. If you think equipment blunders and wardrobe malfunctions are modern-day phenomena, think again. Legend has it that more than one skater had to stitch their outfit seconds before they took to the ice, using nothing but their nerves of steel and bits of borrowed thread. Meanwhile, winter winds seemed determined to make unexpected guest appearances, complicating the delicate maneuvers undertaken on that slippery canvas. Our tale introduces Sonja Henie, the endearing talent from Norway who, rather shockingly, did not compete at these inaugural Winter Games. As an aside, she would make her dazzling debut 4 years later. Young Henie had, however, already captured the whimsy of the skating world with her doll-sized demeanor and ethereal spins. So magical was her promise of future trajectories that other skaters could only chuckle into their lace gloves, acknowledging that there was, indeed, skating royalty amidst their ranks. Just not in Chamonix. In these pioneering games, the women's skating event was a solo endeavor, a brave stage where individual performances called for poetic feats and balletic flair rather than the rocket-like revolutions we know today. The ice might as well have been a ballroom floor for all the elegance demanded. Judges deliberated over musicality and grace rather than the technical dares we now relish. Triple axels? Forget about it. Most skaters were just content to execute a smooth figure eights without planting their mittens into very firm ice. While contests unfolded, audiences gazed, offering polite rounds of applause. Some one brave soul likely sneaked a yawn, and others savored the contrasting serenity of this glacial ballet in an era dominated by roaring cloche hats and jazz. Imagine it, a gathering where genteel precision danced hand in hand with chance. For each competitor stepping daintily onto the rink, it was as though they were partaking in a beloved old-world ritual, one where the only things thicker than the ice beneath them were the layers of fleece and optimism wrapped around their shoulders. Yet beneath this delightful frothiness lay the reality that women's Olympic skating, even in its infancy, was pushing boundaries quietly, almost subversively. A silent revolution bore witness to women defying societal constructs, embracing sportsmanship, and finding new rhythms amidst twirls and swizzles on the world's grandest icy stages. As the sunlight of Chamonix's short winter days refracted brilliantly across the glossy rink, a reflection of the potential embedded within these athletes' futures, one could almost hear the echoes of laughter, lilting like gentle snowfall. This was the sound of history, pirouetting towards a tomorrow only imagined in the exuberant twirls of those who dared to glide forward. Let's gently close this chapter with a deep, cozy sigh, and allow ourselves to drift into the next whispered tales of early women's Olympic skating, where historical tapestries weave brighter, bolder, and occasionally more befuddling chapters on ice. As the last notes of a sleepy waltz from yesteryear softly drift away, we find ourselves skating on the delicate rink of 1920s women's Olympic figure skating, an era before the Triple Axel spun its dizzying magic. Picture this: skaters twirling amidst the gentle fall of snowflakes, not sequins or spotlights in sight, only the moonlight's tender embrace. Today, our dreamy little voyage whisks us through the pearl-tinted panorama of early Olympic skating, a place where elegance wore wool sweaters and every spin risked a comedic slip on the ice. In those early days, the skating rink was poised somewhere between an icy battlefield and an avant-garde dance floor. Picture our daring skaters in skirts brushing the tops of their skates, every move choreographed as much to avoid a tumble as it was to inspire applause. There was no judged artistry in flailing arms, a lesson quickly learned on the slippery canvas of the rink. The ice, then, was as unpredictable as a wayward muse, contributing uninvited plot twists to every graceful performance. Gaze with me at the aspiring skaters, like Norway's own Sonja Henie. Now, Sonja was a marvel of grace and, by some accounts, of absolute dressing delight, often seen trotting onto the ice in costumes that would set any fashion critic aflutter. Imagine frills, a stunning array of gloves, and elaborate headbands designed as much for flair as for warmth. This was the era of carefully executed school figures, traced patterns on the ice where the lines must remain as perfect as an artist's brushstrokes. Each skater, part artist, part acrobat, with the ice as their ever-fickle dance partner. And dear listener, lest we skate over one particular gem, observe how our sprightly skaters contended with the very real demands of their, shall we say, unorthodox skating apparel. Long flowing skirts were not merely a statement of endurance against the cold, but also against gravity. Imagine the elegance required to balance one's center of gravity, while fabric rebelliously trails, threatening to send one headlong into the frosty embrace of the ice. A gymnastic feat indeed, where the physics laws were consulted but never confined, yet creativity flourished. Ladies were known to ingeniously stitch pebbles, secretly tucked into gloves for ballast against the howling winter winds that threatened to spiral one away from sunlit pirouettes into gusty oblivion. We must commend this charming ingenuity, blending couture with ballast, perhaps the very first in fashion-storied attempts at utility wear. Now to the heartwarming, albeit perilous charm of early skating ensembles. We find that wool paired with breath-catching spins often led to spontaneous displays of static electricity, a luminously humorous addition to any performance, making their hair and show a sight to behold. They twirled with aplomb, conducted by an unseen electric symphony. In such magical realism on ice, the geik legends of the sport were born. These early skaters twirled in a time where minds dreamt limitlessly, looking towards possibilities unseen. They caught reality in their blades and imagination in their movements, setting down the ink from which the chapters of modern skating would be eventually scribed. You see, each glide and stumble sprinkled into the icy ether, an ode to dreams sketched on frosted mirrors. As our skaters weave their delicate narratives in the rink's curious embrace, perhaps it's time for you, dear listener, to let the rhythmic swish of nostalgic skates carry you deeper into the world of dreams. Let your imaginations spin softly, pirouette under velvet midnight skies as you drift along a tranquil pathway towards sleep. And just as Sonja might have in her luminous curling ribbons and feather touches, let the curving echoes of the past guide you gently into the cradle of tomorrow's stories. As we glided through the icy allure of Olympic history, it's almost time to tuck this chapter into its cozy nook. Rest assured, there's yet more tail-spun ice to traverse, with our next steps gliding softly into the playful embrace of Chapter 23. But for now, let the echoes of swirling blades play as lullabies to your ever-relaxing ear. The early 20th century had an intriguing way of blending grace with a hint of madness, especially when it came to women's Olympic figure skating. Imagine, if you will, our daring early skaters, a league of remarkably brave women who glided onto the ice wearing outfits resembling heavy ball gowns, complete with corsets so tight that even the thought of a triple axel would likely have sent them fainting. Yes, it was a brave new world, a world where breathing was optional and the ice was a veritable dance floor for the fearless few. Not too many know this, but at the 1908 London Olympics, figure skating, as we know it, made its debut in the Summer Games. Yes, that's right, in summer. They were so excited, it seems, that they were willing to pretend temperatures didn't affect ice. The skating rink, located inside a lush park surrounded by picnickers, was an eclectic mix of frilly umbrellas and clattering teacups, fostering a rather unusual ambiance for figure skating. Picture spectators watching with polite awe as daring athletes glided across an ice surface that seemed more an act of defiance against meteorological norms than an athletic venue. Norwegian skater Sonja Henie, often hailed as an ice goddess in the following decades, would have watched her predecessors from the heavens above, bemused at their artful determination. Before her iconic reinvention of the sport, the early days had women like Madge Syers, another formidable skater, as pioneers. Madge, a woman whose name evoked the lightness of a kindly librarian, was anything but demure on the ice. She somehow managed to win over judges and crowds alike with her spectacular exhibitions that balanced poise with boldness. Imagine stepping so carefully onto the ice while clad in layers of wool, each step simultaneously elegant and calculated, as if navigating a well-placed minefield. Judges, often frowning rather seriously through their monocles, appraised every detail, from the length of a spin to the position of one's hat, the latter being incredibly crucial since one ungraceful loss of a derby could mean tragic deductions. Style was key. Now, when it came time to leap, the act was a pure demonstration of restrained bravery. What looked like a jump was more often a dainty hop, avoiding any trespass into uncharted territory like vertigo. Those faint-hearted hops would someday evolve into today's aerial acrobatics, but for now they were enough to elicit collected applause, and even the occasional surprised gasp from onlookers. The rink itself was quite the curious proposition. A fine puddle that's frozen spirit seemed ever so fragile. The ice, they say, held secrets and whispers of past skaters' undares, chattering underneath, reminding every contender that the task at hand was quite literally on slippery ground. Still, these early ice queens danced as if serenading frosty muses, willing to risk a tumble for a moment of ethereal artistry, a decision that often resulted in quite the royal pratfall, something not captured in later generations' slickly edited highlight reels. Amidst this enchanting chaos, the camaraderie among competitors was enough to melt the iciest of rivalries. They lent each other scarves or moral support, whispering tips on how to best charm the judges without losing a feather from their hats. In those halcyon moments, within a realm of Victorian whimsies and turn-of-the-century ingenuity, friendships skated on thin ice yet thickened in warmth. It's easy, then, to let the mind drift and dream back to those whimsical days of early Olympic figure skating, all rich in plumage and daring ambition. As the day at the rink wound to a close and the faint sound of waltzes on, gramophones faded into evening calm. The tranquility of the scene gently folded itself away, leaving behind light footprints of history on its glistening surface. Thus, our skaters returned to their everyday lives, as ordinary and strange as a penguin in a parlor. The promise of the next competition, where maybe they'd have a bit more room for maneuvering, softly trembled in the future. These tales of tenacity and flair contributed to the legacy from which our modern ice princes and princesses gracefully leap. As the slumber of history begins to settle in, kindly keep your skates by your bedside. for who knows which dreams might press into your icy reverie next. Yes, dear dreamer, beyond this chapter flickers yet another sleepy tale ready to unfurl its whimsical wonders. But for now, in the hushed echoes of yesteryear's delightful glissades, ensconce yourself snugly in rest. The gentle music of history's whispers cradles us once more as we glide into the final chapter of our journey through the frozen realms of early women's Olympic skating. It might be hard to imagine as you snuggle deeper into your blanket, but there was a time when figure skating was less about grace and artistry and more akin to preparing for battle with a pair of bladed shoes. As we briskly waltz into the early 20th century, let us crown our evening with the tale of one extraordinary woman who pirouetted her way into the annals of history. With a name as regal as her accomplishments, Gillis Grafström of Sweden made an indelible mark, even if her name sometimes fluttered through documents without quite the hue of notoriety as some of her male counterparts. Ah, Gillis, a veritable artist on ice, though technically a male skater himself. Bear with me, dear listener, for the roads of storytelling meander delightfully. You see, Gillis competed not long after the introduction of women to the rink in the 1908 London Games, an era brimming with frilly petticoats and ice surfacing, approaches that involved more pond and prayer than Zamboni. Gillis captivated audiences with his sartorial elegance, more akin to a ballroom dancer than an athlete embroiled in the combative sport of the era. Female skaters of his time looked on in admiration, wondering how to blend similar grace with the bustling constraints of their skating skirts. These early Olympic heroines wore costumes more suited to a northern promenade than an athletically demanding Triple Axel. Now, let's dip into the grace and audacity of the women who followed. Redefining resilience, the likes of Sonja Henie twirled into the picture. Sonja, a name that still pirouettes through figure skating lore, grew up on tales of rivalry and grit on ice, eventually growing to embody an inspiring blend of charisma and steely determination. Her journey revealed more than just tame triple toe loops and costume twirls. Attired in shorter skirts that scandalized yet freed, she was both fashionista and pioneer. She turned what once were perilous ice adventures into theatrical displays where calamity transformed into choreography. Her skating wasn't merely a sport, it became an act of storytelling, a prelude to dreaming. Imagine it, whispering again in cozy nostalgia under your blanket fort. Sonja gliding on an icy lake framed by the auroras of her native Norway, perhaps inventing spins and spirals that only the most imaginative thin ice dancer could dream of, all while seamlessly charming the crowds. And as her ponytail danced in the brisk air, the silent symphony of her blades on ice narrated a story of fearless beauty. But our skating saga isn't complete without a playful nod to those renowned early Olympics, when performances would inexplicably transform into events beyond control. Those were the days when the ice seemed to conspire against its visitors, when judges appeared to value proper landing more than artful expression, and yet, oh, the joy of unexpected tumbles and triumphs. So, settles in at bedtime. And as we conclude, settles in at bedtime. And as we conclude this chapter, the past, though archived in gilded scrolls and photogenic memories, spills every now and then into our tranquil present, like the laughter of graceful skaters immortalized, or the comfort of knowing that history's secrets can sing us to sleep. Now, let your eyes flutter closed and drift with those ethereal skaters soaring over frozen lakes and celestial night skies. May dreams unfurl with this same quiet wonder, spinning a tapestry of peaceful stars above your restful head.